We shall move to questions without notice. Are there any questions? And I give the call to the Honourable the Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. The Future Fund was set up by the Howard government in 2006 to strengthen Australia's long-term financial position. For nearly 20 years, governments of both sides have respected the independence of the fund by not meddling with its investment mandate. Having blown the bank and fuelled inflation with its reckless spending, Labor is now raiding the nation's nest egg to cover its economic failures. Prime Minister, why are Australians paying for the Albanese government's economic incompetence?
Call to the Prime Minister.
Thanks very much, Mr Speaker. I was going to give this question to the Treasurer, but the bit in the question,
the member for Casey, the member for Fadden will cease interjecting.
Is just too much to resist, Mr Speaker. It's just too much to resist. When we came to office, there was a $78 billion deficit projected, and we turned that into a $22 billion surplus. And the following year, we turned it into another $15 billion surplus. Something after those opposite, in 2013, were elected with a commitment to do a surplus in the first year and every year thereafter.
None for nine,
but in spite of the money ripped out of health, money ripped out of education, money ripped out of services, places like Veterans Affairs where people couldn't get their payments done, in spite of the robo-debt debacle and everything that we've seen, they ran deficit after deficit after deficit, time after time after time.
Order. The Minister for Infrastructure and the Treasurer. The Leader of the Opposition is entitled to raise a point of order, and he shall do so now.
Mr Speaker, I'd firstly like you to deal with a comment from the Treasurer, who surely will have the decency to withdraw it.
The order. Members on my right. The Treasurer is going to withdraw to help the House.
Mr Speaker.
The Leader of the Opposition has the right to call a point of order, and he's doing so now.
Pretty beneath the Treasurer, I would have thought. But anyway, I guess we see your true character. Mr Speaker, it's on relevance.
The Minister for Housing and the Assistant Minister for Social Services will cease interjecting.
Mr Speaker, obviously it's on relevance. Prime Minister was asked about the Future Fund. Is the Prime Minister prepared to defend his decision on the Future Fund?
Order. The Leader of the House is also entitled to raise on a point of order. Well, everyone wants to stop everyone raising points of order. We can easily do that by not taking any. Sure, no one wants that. The Leader of the House on a point of order.
Mr Speaker, when a question refers to spending and the answer is referring to spending, it's being directly relevant.
Well, and it was also talking about financial position, fuelling inflation, about Australians paying for economic decisions. So in any universe, that's a very broad topic. So the Prime Minister will need to remain relevant to the question that he's been asked about, which is a very broad question containing many moving parts. The Prime Minister has the call.
He will, Mr Speaker, because the Leader of the Opposition, with the broadness of that question, has given me an opportunity not just to confirm the independence of the Future Fund, that's very important, and that their mandate will be about maximising returns, which it will do, But it is also, I'm also asked about inflation. Well, inflation was 6.1 when we came into office, and now it's 2.8. We've done that while 1 million jobs have been created during this term of office. Unemployment at 4.1%. Real wages increasing because we want to make sure that people earn more, but also tax cuts for all Australians because we want people to keep more of what they earn. Across the board, Mr Speaker, when you look at all of the economic indicators, those opposite, the Leader of the Opposition stands and asks a broad question about the economy, and then we see the nuclear overreaction from him when you actually go through what the economic figures are, Mr Speaker. And we know that there are alternatives because he wants Australians to pay more. He has a housing scheme that will drive up house prices. He has a supermarket scheme that will drive up grocery prices. He has an energy scheme that will drive up power prices. And he has an NBN scheme. I noticed they want to privatise the NBN now. They want to privatise the NBN.
Order.
They want to privatise the NBN, which we know what the consequences for regional Australia will be.
Give the call to the honourable member for Pearce.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. How is the Albanese Labor government helping keep young people safe online?
Call to the Prime Minister.
I thank the member for Pearce for her question, and this is an issue that was raised when I was in the member's electorate just a couple of months ago. And today, our government has introduced legislation to create a new minimum age of 16 for access to social media. Social media has a social responsibility, and as a government we have a responsibility to keep our young Australians safe. We know that social media is causing social harm. It can be a force for good to communicate, to engage, but what we've seen so often is that young people have, with sometimes catastrophic consequences, been damaged as a result of some of the way that social media can impact them. It's a point that was made to me with absolute clarity by Matt Howard and Kelly O'Brien, the parents of Charlotte, and Rob Evans, the father of Liv Evans. No parent should lose their child, and in these tragic circumstances it has been just extraordinary what they have gone through. But they've channelled that grief and trauma into something positive, into trying to ensure that other parents don't have to go through the same thing. Now, this is a difficult task. This is something that no government around the world has been able to achieve yet. They're all grappling with it, though. This is a global problem. And we want young Australians essentially to have a childhood. We want parents to have peace of mind. I want young Australians to grow up playing outside with their friends. I want them to communicate people to people, young person to young person, not just through their devices, off their phones and onto the footy fields, the netball courts, the tennis courts, swimming pools, engaging with each other. We know the really positive impact that banning phones in schools has had. We know that it has changed the social interaction that occurs at lunchtime and during play lunch and during that activity and after school. And we know that that has been positive and it's been well received, not just by parents and teachers but by young people themselves. Now, the onus in this legislation will be on the social media companies, not parents or young people. There will be no penalties for users. We all know that technology moves fast and some will try to find ways around these new laws. But that's not a reason to ignore the responsibility that we have to just stand around and wring our hands and say it's too difficult. This legislation should be passed by this parliament, and I hope that it can be passed this year because we want this action to happen as soon as possible.
Call to the honourable member for Hume.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Treasurer. Since this Treasurer has come to office, living standards have collapsed, prices are still rising fast, and Labor's reckless spending has kept inflation higher for longer. Having already made Australians poorer, why is this Labor government making future generations pay for its economic incompetence by raiding the Future Fund?
Member for Moreton is warned. The Treasurer has the call.
Thanks very much, Mr Speaker. A bit like the question that the Prime Minister comprehensively answered a moment ago, it's a bit rich for those opposite to be asking us about inflation when we've more than halved inflation. When we came to office, inflation was higher than 6%. Now it's got a 2 in front of it, Mr Speaker. So why they would ask us about inflation after the shocking record that they had on inflation that they left for us to clean up, that's completely beyond me, Mr Speaker. They've got a lot of nerve to ask about inflation. And the same goes when it comes to asking—
The Treasurer's going to pause. I'm going to get onto this early. The member for Deakin is not going to give a running commentary during this or any other answer. He's going to cease interjecting for the remainder of this question. Otherwise, he'll leave the chamber to assist the House. The Treasurer has the call.
Thank you, Speaker. And they've got a lot of nerve asking about spending as well, as the Prime Minister comprehensively pointed out a moment ago. We've been cleaning up the mess that they left of the budget that they inherited. Now, they said that there would be a surplus in every single one of their 9 years. They went none for 9. They didn't deliver a single surplus in their time in office, and we're 2 for 2, Mr Speaker.
Order.
So if he wants to ask me—
Order. The
Stop pre-scripting his point of order.
Order. The Treasurer is just going to cease talking and just pause. Order. The Treasurer— No, any member can raise a point of order under the standing orders. I don't know why this is so hard for everyone to understand today, but that's the rules and that's what we're following. So, the member for Hume on a point of order.
Mr Speaker, the Prime Minister refused to defend the Treasurer's decision. Perhaps the Treasurer—
The member for Macarthur will leave the chamber under 94A. No. Order. We just had an explanation about why people are entitled to raise points of order, and the member for Hume is entitled to do that. But you can't add extra things in. You can't jump up and just have a free-for-all. Okay? Well, you can't. It's not within the standing orders. And if that starts, you can imagine where that could end. So how about we just agree today, you take the point of order, you say relevance, and you don't add extra things. That's going to help question time. It's going to help everyone do their job, including mine. Treasurer was asked a broad question, like the similar one before. And if you have a question in there about why is the government making future generations pay for government's decisions, well, he's going to have to answer that, and he's answering that. That's the crux of the question. So he's going to be broad with his answer because the question was broad. The Treasurer has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. The Shadow Treasurer would not know the first thing about relevance or about inflation or about government spending. And the record that we have had in office has been to turn around 2 very substantial deficits and to turn them into 2 very substantial surpluses. Now, those are facts. Those are in the final budget outcomes for our 2 full years in office, Mr Speaker. Those are facts.
Order.
And that's because we're banking upward revisions to revenue, we're finding savings, we're doing all of the things that those opposites said they would do, but were completely incapable of doing in their 9, almost 10 years in office, Mr Speaker. So he's welcome to continue to ask me about inflation or spending. We're making progress on both of those fronts. And I'm also very pleased, Mr Speaker, that he's asked me about the Future Fund reforms as well, because we have made some important announcements today about the future of the Future Fund. And what his question goes to, Mr Speaker, is that every single time that they arc up and play up about our changes to the Future Fund reminds every single Australian that they don't want to see more investment in housing. They don't want to see more investment in cleaner and cheaper energy. They don't want to see more investment in the kind of infrastructure which makes our economy more resilient and our people more secure. So the changes that we are announcing today, Mr Speaker, are not about messing with the independence of the Future Fund. They're not about changing the expected rate of return or the Future Fund Board's approach to risk. But what it is about making sure that this tremendous national asset that we have as Australians is working in the service of our national economic interests. And that means working in the service of our workers, our communities, our businesses and our investors. And that's what these changes are all about. If they don't support more investment in housing or cleaner and cheaper energy or infrastructure, that just goes once again to the risks that they pose to our economy and to household budgets.
Call to the member for Spence.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Communications. How will the Albanese Labor government's legislation for social media age limits support families and promote healthier outcomes for young Australians?
Good question.
The call to the Minister for Communications.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for his question. Today, the Albanese government introduced world-leading legislation that sets a minimum age of 16 years for social media. We understand the deep concern of many parents about the harmful impacts of social media, including screen addiction, on their children. Parents have told us that they want help managing their children's use of social media, and the Albanese government is taking action. The Online Safety Amendment, Social Media Minimum Age Bill 2024, will deliver greater protections for young Australians during critical stages of their development. This bill seeks to set a new normative value in society, that accessing social media is not the defining feature of growing up in Australia. It creates a new definition of age-restricted social media platforms to capture those services where a significant purpose of the service is to enable social interaction between two or more users. At a minimum, this will capture TikTok, Facebook, Snapchat, Reddit, Instagram and X, amongst others. The law places the onus on social media platforms, not parents or young people, to take reasonable steps to ensure these protections are in place. The bill and the associated rules I intend to make will ensure continued access to messaging and online gaming and continued access to services which are health and education related, such as Headspace, Kids Helpline, Google Classroom and YouTube. The legislation contains penalties which could see platforms face fines of up to $50 million for systemic breaches. The bill also contains robust privacy provisions over and above what is set out in existing privacy laws. Under the proposed legislation, platforms will be required to destroy data collected for age assurance purposes when the age assurance process is complete. Not destroying data would be a breach of the Privacy Act, with penalties also of up to $50 million. The government will also provide funding for eSafety and the Information Commissioner to support strong oversight. I also want to be open with the parliament that this bill is complex and the approach we are taking is novel. Age assurance technology is not going to be 100% childproof, but we should not let the perfect be the enemy of the good. The legislation brought forward by the Albanese government is, in the most fundamental sense, about helping families when they're sitting around the kitchen table to have that hard conversation about accessing social media. Our laws will enable parents to say no. This normative value is immense because it will reduce the peer pressure that children feel to be on social media just because their friends are. And I thank the many parents, experts and young Australians who've participated in our consultations. The government looks forward to the parliament's examination of the bill, and we will continue to engage constructively to see it progressed.
On indulgence, the member Banks will have the call to support what the minister was saying.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I rise in support of the remarks of the Minister for Communications. This issue of the safety of Australian children online from social media is one of the defining issues of our era. It is of totemic significance in our community. And what we have seen in recent years in the impact on the mental health of Australian children from social media has been absolutely appalling. The social media companies for too long have abrogated their responsibility to care about Australian children. And when we look at the data on the mental health of Australian children, especially girls, we see devastating impacts. We welcome this legislation being put forward. The Leader of the Opposition committed the Coalition to a very similar policy back in June, and we look forward to working constructively on this legislation with a view to seeing it pass through the parliament next week.
Before I call the member for Ringa, I'll just do some welcome and acknowledgements to the parliament. I'm pleased to inform the House that present in the gallery today are participants of the Stephen Fitzgerald Scholars Program, hosted by ANU Australian Studies Institute, led by the Director, Professor Mark Kenny. And I'm pleased to inform the House also that present in the gallery today are the Year 11 participants of the 10 for 10 Regional Development Australia program, which the member for Clare is a mentor. I also see Minister Nat Cook from the South Australian Government visiting us today, and former member for Herbert Cathy O'Toole, and young leaders from the Melbourne City Football Club as guests of the member for Holt, and also students from Fitzroy Community School from the electorate of Wills. Welcome to you all. And I give the call to the honourable member for Warringah.
To the Treasurer, the government has fast-tracked significant legislation that will pay the Labor Party, on current numbers, $2.7 million per year for administration funding, assistance funding, includes staff cost, attendance at conferences, seminars, office accommodation, even payment for interest of its loans. Do you accept that the government has failed to acknowledge any economies of scale, that this is poor economic management of public funds and an outrageous slap in the face of Australians doing it tough?
Give the call to the Treasurer.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Of course I don't agree with those characterisations. Public funding of elections and of our democracy has been an ongoing feature of our system for some time, and what we're trying to do via the great work of Minister Farrell and others is to minimise the impact of big money on our politics. That's our motivation here, and that's what the legislation is all about.
Call to the honourable member for Hawke.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Education. Why is the Albanese Labor government pursuing important reforms to cap international student numbers and crack down on shonky providers? What is standing in the way and why?
Call to the Minister for Education.
Thanks very much, Mr Speaker, and can I thank my friend, the sensational member for Hawke, for his question. Almost every day in this place, my old mate, the member for Herbert, asks me to tell a story.
Order.
Well, boy, oh boy, do we have a story to tell today. Today's Sydney Morning Herald that reads, "Senior Liberal headlines event for student visa agents before tanking migration bill." The story reads as follows. Coalition frontbencher Sarah Henderson headlined an event for migration agents and private colleges and launched a new brand for a Liberal Party member who helps international students extend stays in Australia just a month before tanking Labor's bill to crack down on private education sector. It goes on. Henderson, who leads the opposition's education policy and now it seems the migration policy as well, spoke at the private forum attended by dozens of colleges and agents, some of whom have had restrictions imposed on them by the tertiary education regulator or helped international students appeal their visa rejections. It goes on. Some of the companies are also Liberal Party donors. The plot thickens. I said on Tuesday, Mr Speaker, it was hard to believe that this opposition leader would get into bed with the Greens on migration. Now it seems that bed's getting pretty full of education agents. But there are some people that are getting out of the bed, because the story goes on. Quote, several shadow ministers and backbenchers have said there was frustration in the party room about how the coalition reached this position, and some left confused about how to articulate it publicly. Well, I'd be confused too, Mr Speaker, because let's remember what this bill does. This bill responds to the shocking findings from the Nixon Review and the Parkinson Review about the exploitation of Australia's visa system by dodgy education agents and providers. And I remind the House about the bill that's in the Senate that the Liberal Party and the Greens are in the bed together at the moment trying to stop. It prevents education providers from owning education agent businesses. It requires providers to educate Aussie students first for 2 years before they're allowed to recruit international students, and it prevents providers who are under serious regulatory investigation from recruiting new international students. That's what the Liberal Party is planning to vote against. And now, just perhaps, we know why.
The time has concluded. Call to the honourable member for Hume.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Treasurer. The first chairman of the Future Fund, David Murray, says the Treasurer's raid on the fund, quote, means it can be used for boondoggle budgeting. Having already made Australians poorer, why is this Labor government making future generations pay for its economic incompetence by raiding the Future Fund?
Call to the Treasurer.
Thanks very much, Mr Speaker. And once again, a couple of elements to that question on the matter of Australian living standards. I remind the House and people watching at home that when we came to office, real wages were falling in 5 consecutive quarters, and we've got real wages growing again. And that's one of the important ways that we're trying to help people make up the ground that they lost during the cost of living pressures which began under those opposite, Mr Speaker. But I'm asked about the Future Fund as well, and I welcome once again the opportunity to talk about the very important changes that we're announcing today when it comes to the Future Fund. Because this side of the House wants to see more investment in housing, that side wants to see less investment in housing. Right. This side wants to see more investment in cleaner and cheaper energy. That side wants to see less investment in cleaner and cheaper energy. This side of the House wants to make our infrastructure and our economy more resilient so that our people are more secure, and those opposite want to get in the way of that, Mr Speaker. Now, I'm asked about the comments from David Murray. And David Murray, I acknowledge in the press conference I gave earlier, has got a right to express a view about these kinds of things, but David Murray is not on this occasion correct. He is factually wrong to make the comments that he is making. And I refer him and I refer the Shadow Treasurer to the investment mandate, which makes it very clear that the fund will be required to consider the national priorities in its investment decisions where possible, where appropriate and consistent with strong returns. And that's the main point that we're making today, Mr Speaker. Nothing that is being announced today is about getting in the way of the Future Fund continuing to realise these strong returns or the same expectations on rate of return, the same treatment of risk. What we are asking the Future Fund to do, and proudly, is we're asking the Future Fund, where it makes sense and where it can make the fund money, to consider these big national challenges which were neglected for too long in the wasted decade of missed opportunities from those opposite. And that should not be an especially controversial suggestion for us to make, Mr Speaker. We are proud of the changes that we're announcing today when it comes to the future of the Future Fund. And every time the Shadow Treasurer asks me about this, what he's really telling everybody is he wants less investment in housing and energy and infrastructure. And this is one of the many ways that those opposite pose an unacceptable risk to household budgets and to the economy more broadly. And we know that they are a risk because we know their record. We know their record of falling real wages and higher inflation and huge deficits and $1 trillion in Liberal debt in a budget weighed down with waste and rorts with whom the Shadow Treasurer has been associated. So we make no apologies for the changes we're making. We're proud of them. They're about ensuring that investment flows in ways that benefit the Australian people and strengthen their economy.
The call to the member for Wills.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is also to the Treasurer. What is the Albanese government doing to help Australians with cost of living, and what obstacles standing in their way?
Good question. Call to the Treasurer.
Thanks very much to the member for Wills for his very important question. I think it's worth reminding people that even with all of the progress that this government under this Prime Minister is making in the course of this final parliamentary fortnight across a range of really important legislative areas, what we've been able to do is to maintain a primary, overwhelming focus on cost of living and the fight against inflation. And we saw out of the United Kingdom overnight just how important it is that we maintain this focus. What we saw from the United Kingdom last night is inflation, both core and headline inflation, is going up in the United Kingdom. And what that means is that inflation is rising in the UK, the US, Canada and Europe at the same time as inflation is coming down here in Australia in welcome and encouraging ways. Inflation has more than halved since we came to office. It's in the Reserve Bank's target range for the first time since 2021. But we know that there is more progress to be made. We know it's not mission accomplished on inflation. We know there's not always a direct correlation between the national economic data, which is going our way, and how people are feeling and faring in communities right around Australia. We acknowledge that. We recognise that. We also know that people have got to make up a lot of lost ground. As I said before, real wages were falling substantially when we came to office, inflation was much higher. Those opposite were going after Medicare and wages and all of the rest of it. And so we've got to help people make up lost ground, and that's what we're doing. And that's why the cost of living is our highest priority. And that's why it's so important that in the last 4 consecutive quarters we've had real wages growth in our economy. It's why it's so important we're rolling out the tax cuts and all of the other responsible cost of living relief that we are providing, Mr Speaker. Now, we know that those opposite are a risk to all of that because we know their record. We know when they were in office they came after people's wages, and we had low wages growth, falling real wages. We know they're a risk when it comes to price pressures because inflation was more than twice what it is now on their watch. We know they're a risk because they are running huge deficits and they had almost nothing to show for $1 trillion in Liberal debt. And we know they're a risk because every time we've tried to help someone with the cost of living, those opposite have tried to oppose it. They wanted an election over tax cuts for every taxpayer. They didn't want energy bill relief and all the rest of it. And that's why, Mr Speaker, Australians would pay a very hefty price for the comical incompetence of the Shadow Treasurer and the reckless arrogance of this opposition leader. If those opposite ever got their hands on government again, people would see the same attacks on Medicare and wages and on cost of living help, the same enormous deficits, the same higher inflation. We know that because we saw that last time they were in office.
Call to the Shadow Treasurer.
My question is to the Treasurer. Can the Treasurer confirm whether he discussed the decision to raid the Future Fund with former Treasurer Wayne Swan before the decision was announced?
Order. Members on my left and my right. There has to be more silence while questions are being asked. And before the Deputy Leader of the Opposition, unbelievable. I'm explaining to the House how I want to see more courtesy and shown, and then interjections like that. You're warned. It's not appropriate. So, for the remainder of question time today, everyone, lift the standards. The Treasurer has the call.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. No, I discussed it with the board of the Future Fund and with the chair of the Future Fund. We went to the board, Minister Gallagher and I went to the board of the Future Fund in August of this year. We briefed them on our thinking, the issues that we were trying to progress. We had a very productive discussion with them. We followed that up with the chair of the Future Fund subsequently, and we've worked together very closely with the Future Fund to make these announcements that we're making today. More broadly, publicly, I've said on a number of occasions, and I've said to the Investor Roundtable, including the group that I'll be convening here in Canberra tomorrow, that we would be mad not to find ways to make our big national advantages, including our pools of capital in superannuation and the Future Fund, work in our national economic interest. I've made my priorities very clear publicly on a number of occasions. And that's what today is partly about. That's what the Investor Roundtables are about, and it's what the work that I've been doing with the Future Fund has been all about. And so I want to thank the board members of the Future Fund. I want to thank the chair of the Future Fund for the way that we've been able to work together. And now I understand the interest in one element of what has been announced today. I genuinely do, Mr Speaker.
Order.
But one of the reasons why there are 3 elements and not just one to the changes we're making today is because we've worked so closely with the Future Fund. Not drawing down before 2032 is an important part of what's being announced today, and also all of the governance improvements associated with the Statement of Expectations as well. Those are the fruits of working in a consultative and a collaborative way with the Future Fund, with the Investor Roundtable, with the community more broadly. I've flagged the changes in the past that we made today, and I announced them earlier.
Give a call to the honourable member for Patterson.
Thanks, Speaker. My question is to the Deputy Prime Minister. What measures has the Albanese Labor government taken to build a highly skilled workforce to support defence and defence industry, and are there any barriers to this DPM?
Give a call to the Minister for Defence and the Deputy Prime Minister.
Well, can I thank the member for her question? As we embark on a significant increase in our defence capability in building infantry fighting vehicles, in constructing ships and frigates, in building submarines, one of the really big challenges is the human challenge. We've got to get the people with the skills to get this done, and at the heart of that is vocational and trade training. Now, we have partnered with TAFE SA to increase the number of apprenticeships for fabrication, mechanical and electrical qualifications. We have partnered with South Metro TAFE in Perth for training which is relevant to the sustainment of submarines, and we are constructing the Skills and Training Academy at the Osborne Naval Shipyard, which is central to providing that on-the-job training which will build the workforce that will build our future frigates and submarines. But what underpins all of that is the Albanese government's commitment to free TAFE. 100,000 places each and every year from 2027, in addition to the 500,000 places which have already been taken up since our government has come to office. You cannot support tradies without supporting their training, and tradies are at the heart of building our nation's defences, which is why the opposition of the Liberal Party to TAFE is so recklessly dangerous. If you take a line through the questions that have been asked in this place by the Alternative Skills Minister, what is completely clear is that she thinks that TAFE just doesn't work. And when you look at the Leader of the Opposition in his entire parliamentary career, he has barely used the word TAFE. When the TAFE sector look to the Liberal Party, all they see is a barren policy permafrost, which, quite frankly, is a risk to our national security. Now, those opposite still have not committed to Labor's increase in defence funding. The poor Shadow Minister for Defence has been left to haplessly wander around the shadow cabinet, desperately looking for an affirmation of any of his ideas with all the confidence of a lost dog, while the Leader of the Opposition is now presiding over a Liberal Party which has completely surrendered any of its defence credentials. Well, Mr Speaker, on this side of the House, the Albanese government is investing in the importance of TAFE as a critical enabler of our nation's security and in keeping Australians safe.
Just going to ask the Deputy Prime Minister, I didn't want to interrupt him, just going to ask him to withdraw that term that he referred to the Shadow Minister, please. I wasn't happy with that. Order.
I withdraw, Mr Speaker.
Language is important. Order. The Shadow Treasurer has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Treasurer. Will the Treasurer guarantee that no spending in the federal budget in housing projects, green projects or infrastructure projects will be assumed by the Future Fund?
Give the call to the Treasurer.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Yes, I can, and unfortunately this question is based on a completely unsurprising misunderstanding or misrepresentation from the Shadow Treasurer. Now, if the Shadow Treasurer knew anything about the Future Fund, if he knew anything about the announcement which has been made today, he would understand a couple of things. First of all, as I reminded him a moment ago, there will be no drawdowns from the Future Fund, at least until 2032. And that means that there will not be it won't be any taking money out of the Future Fund and putting it towards the budget, Mr Speaker. That's the question I'm answering, which he asked a moment ago. That's what I was asked about.
Order.
That's what I was asked about.
The Leader of the Opposition.
And so the priority areas that we want the Future Fund to invest in are consistent with the government's priorities, but in addition to the substantial program of investment that we already have going, Mr Speaker. Now, we understand what this question is really about, Mr Speaker. We know what this question is really about. They want less investment in housing. That's why they team up with the Greens in the Senate and vote against investment in housing.
Order.
They want less investment in cleaner and cheaper energy, and that's why they vote the way they do in the parliament. And they don't want to make our economy more resilient. Now, Mr Speaker, if those opposite knew the first thing about the Future Fund or indeed about Australia's major economic pressures and opportunities, they would support, not oppose, our efforts to make sure that capital flows more efficiently in our economy in the service of our national economic objectives to the ultimate benefit of the Australian people, workers, communities, businesses and investors. And every question they asked and every ill-informed dishonest statement that they make about the changes that we are making today reminds people out there in the broader Australian community that they don't want to see investment in housing or cleaner and cheaper energy or infrastructure, and we do.
The call to the member for Macquarie.
Thank you, Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Housing and Homelessness. What is the Albanese Labor government doing to help more Australians into home ownership after a decade of neglect, and what challenges does the government face?
Give the call to the Minister for Housing and the Minister for Homelessness.
Thank you, Speaker, and I want to thank the fantastic member for Macquarie for her question.
Order.
Those of us.
Can the member for New England and the Minister for Infrastructure not have a conversation? Completely disrespectful. The Minister has the call.
Thank you, Speaker. I want to thank the fantastic member for Macquarie for her question, and I think most of us in this chamber know that her community has been profoundly and persistently affected by bushfire and flood. So she has this real interest in housing construction. But she also represents a lot of people, young people in the Blue Mountains and surrounds, who have a really simple aspiration, and that is that they want to get the same housing opportunities as their parents and grandparents were given. And the Albanese government, because of the advocacy of people like the member for Macquarie, is doing everything that we can to give it to them. Speaker, Australians are doing it really tough right now, and housing costs are a really big part of that problem. We've got a housing crisis in our country that's been cooking for 30 years, and a party opposite me that spent a decade sitting on the Treasury benches and doing absolutely nothing about it.
Order.
Now, Labor's made a change here. We have an ambitious $32 billion housing agenda, which is helping build more homes, helping renters get a better deal, and helping more Australians get that dream they have of home ownership. Now, part of the mix here is our Help to Buy legislation. This is going to help support 40,000 low and middle income earners get into home ownership. Speaker, we're talking here about childcare workers, about aged care workers, about nurses. This is a bill for them. These are Australians who need and deserve the help of government. Now, who on earth would stand in the path of 40,000 deserving people get into home ownership? It is the unholy anti-housing alliance that has been built in this parliament by the Coalition and by the Australian Greens. Every time in this parliament we have offered the opportunity for the Liberals and the Greens to come together and help us address the housing crisis, they have chosen to play politics over making progress on this issue. The Greens have teamed up with Peter Dutton to oppose home ownership.
The Minister will refer to members by their correct titles.
The Greens have teamed up with the Liberals to oppose home ownership. They've teamed up with the Liberals to oppose the building of more social and affordable homes. And it's not just on housing, Speaker. The Greens have teamed up with the Liberals to oppose environmental protections and economic reform. Now, we're coming around the straight into the election, Speaker, and I want Australians to remember they are going to have a real choice at this election when it comes to housing, between a party of pessimism, a party of protest and a party of progress. A Liberal Party that has a horrible track record when it comes to housing and are motivated only by nasty negativity, and a Greens Party that are more interested in waving placards than getting real Australians into the housing that they deserve. We're taking a different approach as a government. We've done the hard graft and we're going to build the homes that ordinary people are going to rely on. Thanks, Speaker.
To the call to the honourable member for Indi.
Thank you, Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Aged Care. In my regional electorate, elderly people face year-long waiting times for home care packages. Provider shortages and long travel distances mean people are missing out on help showering, eating and taking medication. The situation is dire. I welcome the new Aged Care Act, but its implementation is still more than 6 months away. What is the government doing now to ensure older Australians can age safely and with dignity in their home?
I give the call to the Minister for Aged Care and Sport.
I thank the member for Indi for her question, and I agree with her that we need to do better by everybody in aged care, which is why we are bringing in once-in-a-generation reform, which we are currently working through amendments in the other place, and we hope very much to be able to deliver that as soon as possible for people like the people waiting for better care in your electorate. What are we doing now? In the budget, we funded more than $500 million worth of home care packages to the tune of 24,500 new packages. They are rolling out. We expect more than 15,500 to be rolled out by the end of this month. So those are rolling out consistently in this last year before 1 July, when the new support at home regime is due to begin. And as you'll know, because I know you take keen interest in this, when support at home is introduced, there are particular measures in there to address the particular nuanced challenges of regional areas and of thin markets in regional areas like yours. More than $300 million, for example, or more than $600 million all up, to assist support at home providers who are in thin markets to address their particular issues when it comes to financial viability. Starting from 1 July 2025, grants are there to support service delivery in rural and remote locations like those which you represent, for people with diverse backgrounds, people with diverse life experiences. We also included in our budget this year, whilst we were still working to land these once-in-a-generation reforms, $21.6 million for regional, rural and remote-focused home care workforce support. I know you've spoken to me before about the crippling workforce shortages in your area. We recognise that. We put an extra $21.6 million in there to attract 4,000 new workers to the home care sector. We're going to keep viability supplements available where home care packages are provided to care recipients in the modified Monash model 4 to 7 locations. You'll be aware that the now $15 billion pay rise for aged care workers has been having really good effect, particularly in regional and remote areas. Every single human resource statistic is up. People are staying, people are coming back to aged care, turnover. And I know a provider who looks after rural and remote areas, his service, he said, his turnover has dropped 40% since the pay rise came in. 40% turnover dropped because people are actually coming and staying in home care. So these are all the things that we are doing to try and keep the system on track until 1 July, and we really hope that come 1 July next year, people like the people that you represent will really feel the once-in-a-generation reforms that we've worked so hard to deliver.
Give a call to the member for Parramatta.
Is to the Minister for Early Childhood Education. How is the Albanese Labor government attracting, training and retaining more early childhood educators?
Call to the Minister for Early Childhood Education and the Minister for Youth.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the wonderful member for his question, but also for his continued and unrelenting advocacy for families and children in his electorate. Now, as I've said before, Mr Speaker, early childhood educators and teachers do really highly skilled and professional work, and they provide an essential service, a service that allows parents to work, to study, and that allows primary caregivers, who are mainly women, to be able to return to work or study if they so wish. But for too long, Mr Speaker, the sector has been losing these essential workers, and this government has taken action to change this. We're helping to build and keep the workforce that our children and families need and rely on. And a significant part of that commitment to grow this workforce has been our fee-free TAFE. In the first 18 months of fee-free TAFE, there were over 35,000 enrolments in the early childhood education and care courses. Now, that's 35,000 potential more educators and workers in a sector that is desperate for more workers. Earlier this year, I visited Leederville TAFE with the member for Perth, and we spoke to some early childhood education students who are benefiting from fee-free TAFE. Every single one of them told us that they would not have been able to undertake their course in early childhood education and follow that passion if it had not been for free TAFE. Now, this is what one student said. One student told the member for Perth and I, that person said, "Fee-free TAFE opened doors for me." And you know what, Mr Speaker? Under this government, the doors will stay open because fee-free TAFE is here to stay. Here to stay. We don't just want to keep attracting more people to the sector. We want to keep those incredible people who are already working there as well. Another one of the students that we met was returning to early childhood education after trialling other things. And that student told us that they were returning because of the supports that were now available to them. And among those supports is the 15% wage increase that we are delivering. Now, those students at Leederfield TAFE, they're about ready to graduate. They'll graduate sometime in November. And by December, they'll be seeing another $100 in their pay packet. And by next year, that'll be another $150 in their pay packet. Fee-free TAFE is a vital pipeline, the pipeline that Australia needs to ensure that there are essential services provided by a highly skilled and trained workforce that can continue to grow and flourish. And only an Albanese Labor government will deliver it.
Time has concluded. Call to the member for Hume.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Treasurer. Labor has badly damaged the Queensland and Victorian economies. Now the Albanese Labor government is raiding Australia's sovereign wealth fund. Will the government guarantee that future fund investments will not assume spending commitments currently on the federal budget?
Call to the Treasurer.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. I've already answered that question, but I'll answer it again. I'll answer it again, and I'll answer it in a different way, given the Shadow Treasurer was unable to understand the first way I explained it to him. Now, Mr Speaker, what we are proposing with the Future Fund is not to replace, and it's not instead of, government investment. The government is budgeting for and is rolling out substantial investments in housing and in energy and in infrastructure, and we are not proposing to change the carve-up between what the government does in our budgets and what the Future Fund does in their decisions. And I explain once again to the Shadow Treasurer, I think everybody else understands this by now, but the Shadow Treasurer strangely does not, is that what is being proposed today does not change the fact that the Future Fund takes its investment decisions independently. We're not changing the expectations about the benchmark rate of return. We're not changing the Future Fund's appetite for risk. We're leaving independence, benchmark, rate of return and risk as it was. And what we're saying to the Future Fund is, as you make these investments, as you focus primarily on returns for the Australian taxpayer, we need you to make sure that you are focused as well on the major economic challenges that we confront as a country. Now, if those opposite don't think we've got a challenge with housing, they should say so. If they want there to be less investment in housing, just fess that up, Mr Speaker. And same for clean energy, same for infrastructure and economic resilience. Now, there is no shortage of economic challenges and pressures coming at us from around the world and from around our country. And our job is to modernise our economy, to manage those pressures and to maximise the economic opportunities of a defining decade, and to do that in the interests of our workers and businesses, our communities and our investors. And that's what these changes are all about. Now, Mr Speaker, I've got to say, I expected the usual, predictable, partisan hyperventilating from the usual, predictable and partisan places, and that's what we've seen today. But what it is designed to obscure, the first time the Shadow Treasurer has got more than a question at 3 o'clock in a long time. What it's all designed to obscure is that they don't want to see investment in housing and energy. We want to see housing and investment in energy. The Future Fund will play its role independently. We'll continue to invest proudly because we've got a lot of ground to make up. Because when those opposite were in office, we had a wasted decade of missed opportunities and warped priorities and a budget full of waste and rorts. We've been cleaning up the mess because we don't want to see Australia go backwards. We don't want to see all of this put at risk because of the record of those opposite.
The call to the honourable member for Cunningham.
My question is to the Minister for Health. What action is the Albanese Labor government taking to strengthen Medicare and make medicines cheaper for all Australians after a decade of cuts and neglect? Are there any threats to Medicare?
Call to the Minister for Health and Aged Care.
Well, thank you, Speaker, and I thank the member for Cunningham for the question, but also for her support for the urgent care clinic in Wollongong. And I'm happy to say that today, Mr Speaker, we opened the 78th Medicare urgent care clinic. This one in Southport, the second clinic on the Gold Coast. the first Gold Coast clinic, Mr Speaker, in Oxenford, has already seen 10,000 patients, 4,000 of them for patients under the age of 15, and every single one fully bulk billed. They're getting terrific urgent care, free of charge, but also taking pressure off the busiest emergency department in the country, Mr Speaker.
Order.
And, Mr Speaker, we're not only opening more urgent care clinics, we're delivering more doctors and we're delivering more bulk billing. In the past 2 years, we've seen more doctors enter the system than at any time in the past decade, Mr Speaker. And our record investments in bulk billing have finally stopped the slide in bulk billing that we inherited from those opposite after a decade of cuts and neglect, something the College of GPs called freefall, Mr Speaker. But we've also seen a rebound in every single state and territory and seen an additional 5.4 million free visits to the GP just in the past 12 months, Mr Speaker. Now, we know there's much more to do, but we are starting to turn Medicare around after a decade of cuts and neglect. But as the member points out, all of this progress is under threat from a Liberal Party who has never supported Medicare, led by an anti-Medicare trinity who all have formed in this area. Now, of course, the gold medal for undermining Medicare always goes to the Leader of the Opposition, voted by doctors as the worst health minister in the history of Medicare, after he tried to abolish bulk billing altogether, after he tried to take $50 billion out of public hospitals and so much else besides, Mr Speaker. But coming up second is the Deputy Liberal Leader, who takes a more Socratic approach to these things, taking time this week to explain the deep philosophical underpinnings, the deep philosophy under their attacks to bulk billing, Mr Speaker, because apparently, according to this philosopher, no, you simply don't value something if you don't pay for it, Mr Speaker. Very, very deep as always, Mr Speaker. And then always bringing up the rear is old mate, the Shadow Treasurer. On radio this morning, earlier this week, promising to cut billions of dollars from our investments to strengthen Medicare, promising to close the urgent care clinics, and then coming in yesterday afternoon and pretending he didn't even say it. Well, the faces might change, Mr Speaker, but the story is always the same. You can't trust the Liberal Party with Medicare.
Call to the honourable member for Clark.
Speaker, my question is to the Treasurer. Treasurer, the refusal to grant deductible gift recipient status to the Headstone project in South Australia, recognising unmarked graves of World War I soldiers, casts doubt over the existing DGR status in other states. This would be a betrayal of the soldiers and a blow to those who have worked so hard to grow the project. So, is it your intention to withdraw DGR status for the project, or will you commit to granting it nationwide?
Call to the Treasurer.
Thanks very much, Mr Speaker, and to the honourable member for his question. We've found a better way to support the really important work of this valued organisation. In response to the member for Mayo not that long ago who asked the similar question, the Assistant Minister to the Treasury and I looked into the matters raised by yourself and by your colleague next to you. And we say the same thing now that we said then. We do our best to make decisions about DGR status, conscious of the budget pressures and all of the other priorities. But in looking into this for the member for Mayo, as we said that we would, we've discovered that there is another important way that we're helping the organisation do its work. Now, I wanted to say that the government is really grateful for the service of our veterans, and we know that the important role that government funding plays in creating and preserving and maintaining memorials to their sacrifice. And when Assistant Minister Lee and I looked into this, we discovered that there are multiple ways that we help our veterans honour the graves of our fallen. And I acknowledge as well the Veterans Affairs Minister as well, because the Office of Australian War Graves takes care of war cemeteries and war graves. They work in Australia, as you know, Papua New Guinea, the Solomons. They also build and look after official Australian memorials overseas. And in Minister Keogh's portfolio, he's got a program called Marking Private Graves Grants Program. really important program. I acknowledge his work and his commitment to that program. And what this grants program means is throughout Australia they can commit to individuals and groups working to identify the unmarked graves of First World War.
Order. The Treasurer is answering a question directly. I'll just ask him to pause, but with giving this sort of detail, I don't know how you can take a point of order. But
Mr. Speaker, it's on relevance. We were a minute ago. The question was, is there going to be DGR state?
The member has been here long enough to know that is not how points of order work. And the member for Clark was entitled to ask his question. If he was so aggrieved, I'm sure he would have taken a point of order. But I can't make any minister, as the member knows for being here so long, a yes or no answer. The Treasurer has the call.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I don't think the member for New England should try and piggyback on the dedicated work of the member for Clark and the member for Mayo next to him, asking an important question, and which I'm answering in a respectful way. And I'm pointing out that in addition to the consideration we give to the DGR status, Minister Keogh and his portfolio, working closely with all of us, has got other ways as well that we support this really important work. And I wanted to confirm for the House, having looked into it, that one of the community groups, ex-service organisations and people who can apply for this funding assistance to mark unmarked private graves of First World War veterans is the Headstone Project. And the Headstone Project, I can confirm for the member for Clark and for the member for Mayo next to him and for the parliament, has been a successful recipient of grants under this program. And I raise it in that fashion, Mr. Speaker, because I understand that there is concern around the DGR status and the different state branches of this important organisation. And I think it's really important that we support their work, and I think this is the most appropriate way for us to do it.
Give the call to the honourable member for Werriwa.
Thanks, Mr. Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. How is the Albanese Labor government working to tackle the challenge of global inflation and create jobs, opportunity and economic growth for Australia? What opposition has there been to these measures?
The call to the Prime Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the member for Werriwa for her question. Indeed, my government has been very focused, given global inflation, to impact on cost of living pressures that we know people have been under. And I'm asked what measures we've done and also what opposition there's been. And there's something in common there, Mr. Speaker, between those lists, because every single one of the measures that we've put in place has been opposed by those opposite. Whether it's tax cuts for every taxpayer, tripling the Medicare bulk billing incentive, student debt relief, cheaper medicines, cheaper childcare, energy bill relief, free TAFE, more money for public and affordable housing, Help to Buy scheme to get more people into home ownership, a pay rise for childcare workers, a pay rise for aged care workers. The 3 consecutive submissions that we have made that have resulted in the minimum wage being increased 3 times since we're in government. And as a direct result of those measures, we've seen, whilst putting that downward pressure on inflation, which is why it's been designed that way, we've seen inflation drop from a 6% figure and rising to 2%, 2.8 and falling under our watch. And at the same time, as we've seen that occurring, we're seeing real wages increasing so that people are earning more and getting to keep more of what they earn. And we know that they actually voted 48 times against our IR reforms, which have got wages moving again. But this week we saw the quiet bit said out loud by the Deputy Leader for what the philosophical underpinnings of this were, when the Deputy Leader said it's a key principle and tenet of the Liberal Party. If you don't pay for something, you don't value it. And that's what goes to explain the opposition to free TAFE, because the bizarre position that they have from those opposite, that somehow free TAFE, giving people skills and opportunity in life, is negative, is just extraordinary.
The Deputy Leader of the Opposition.
And then, of course, there's Medicare. there's Medicare, because we know that they don't like people seeing a doctor for free. We know that is against their philosophy, and it certainly was against the practice when this guy was the health minister. It might also explain their opposition to renewables, because the sun's free. They'd much rather have a nuclear reactor sometime in the 2040s, the most expensive form possible. They want people to pay more for medicine, more to see a doctor, more for the emergency room, more for uni, more for childcare. There is a consistency to their approach, and we know why that's the case, Mr Speaker. And on that note, I ask that further questions be placed on the notice paper.